What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the Content Corner. Sorry it's been so long since the last upload, but it's a combination of not knowing what to make a video on and not having time to make a video. So I'm going to do my best to get back into a regular schedule here, post a few more videos closer together so you guys have something to watch and feel like the YouTube channel is worthwhile. But nonetheless, today what I've got for you, I'm a little behind on, but I still want to make a video on it anyway. And that is the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. Now, I know we're a little bit into our Middle Ages unit already, but we never really got a chance to talk about this in class. So I thought I'd at least make a video on it to kind of close out that unit, round things up, and just kind of give you that information here. So hopefully you enjoy it. If you do, of course, drop a like. And yeah, without further ado, let's get into the video. When we talk about the Roman Empire and the fall of the Roman Empire, it's important to remember that there's not just one single cause that led to this. It didn't happen overnight. It wasn't one thing that caused the entire empire to collapse. It happened over a couple hundred years. It was a steady decline, and there was multiple reasons for it that we'll talk about as we go through. The first thing to note is just how massive the Roman Empire was at its peak. So this is about 117 AD. You can see it stretches all the way from the Middle East and Mesopotamia into northern Africa and up into northwestern Europe and into Britain. Because this was so large, they actually stopped expanding. Now, this caused a couple different problems. As the empire expanded, they were able to bring in more money, more slaves into the empire. The money was used to pay for government functions, such as maintaining their army. But of course, the slaves were brought in to work in the fields and craftsmen to produce things for the empire. Without bringing those slaves in from all these different places, they now have a labor shortage, which is just not having enough workers to do the jobs that need to be done. All right, we actually have been experiencing a labor shortage in the US the last year and a half or so due to the pandemic. Because they had less money to pay for things, obviously when the government runs out of money, what's the first thing they do? Raise taxes. So because they do that, now you're pulling money out of local cities and village economies. Now you're hurting them. In addition, wealthy people stopped paying taxes because tax collectors were corrupt in some cases. So now because that's happening, now the government's last resort is to create more money, or more coins in this instance. But that's not a good thing. If you're running out of money, you don't want to create more, because once there's too much of it in the economy, it leads to inflation, and inflation lowers that value of the money because there's so much in circulation. So that's not helping them out anymore. Finally, you had all kinds of invasions and civil wars throughout the empire. You had Romans fighting each other for control. As they did this, they were stealing from citizens. They were destroying farms, taking all their crops. Trade is disrupted because now the empire is unsafe to travel. And with these crops not being produced because the farms are destroyed, now they're not being transported throughout the empire. So now there's food shortages. And that leads to higher prices of food. That's actually just simple supply and demand. Your supply is decreasing because resources aren't available to produce things. And as that happens, the prices of that product will go up. So that's a quick little economic lesson for you that we'll go over a little later in the year. People are losing their jobs and they have less money to buy goods. So already we're on a steady decline. Running out of money and resources, not looking good for the empire so far. Little later on, Rome is having trouble recruiting new soldiers. Because of this, emperors had to resort to hiring foreign mercenaries. Mercenaries are just soldiers for hire, so they bring in people from outside of the empire and pay them to fight in their own army. A lot of them were Germanic tribes from other parts around Europe, and of course, since they're not Roman, they're going to be less loyal than Roman soldiers. To kind of pay for this loyalty, the emperors offered these legions, legions is just a large unit of soldiers, a bonus when they rose to power, which isn't a problem in itself, but over time they drastically increased that pay, and that was financially unsustainable because we've already talked about the empire didn't have enough money as it is, so now promising, upwards of 600 men a very high wage or bonus, you just can't pay for that. And a lot of them couldn't pay. And if you couldn't pay, you were killed and replaced by someone who could pay. And with this all happening, you had about 22 emperors in 50 years during this period. So that's almost a new emperor every 2 years, which we don't even elect presidents at that rate. So you can see just how unsteady and unstable their government leadership was. And the Senate couldn't help out. They were just as corrupt as some of these emperors were. So they were unwilling and unable to kind of check the emperor's power during this. And because this is all happening, you have unsteady and corrupt Senate and emperors, leads us to believe that the Roman citizens just became less faithful in their government. They wouldn't really rely on them to help. They kind of thought that they were just going to be left in the dust. The government would do what's best for them and nobody else. So now you have your citizens starting to turn on their own government. So as we said before, this was a very large empire. Again, I'll pull up this map again just so you can kind of take a look at it. The problem is, too, you also have another group or another tribe kind of up in this area called the Huns. They were nomadic, so they didn't really settle in one spot. They just moved all around the area, taking over whatever land they could. Of course, with that happening, they were pretty violent. You had all these other Germanic tribes moving into the empire and migrating in to kind of get away from the Huns, which was fine. In certain cases, the Romans would actually let in certain tribes to kind of live there. One of these was the Goths. They would actually let them move into the empire and live, but in return, they had to serve in the military. That was kind of their trade-off. So if you're going to come live here, you're going to help us out by serving in our military. Which they did. But the problem was the Romans treated the Goths very poorly. Very mean to them, kind of blew them off. And naturally, the Goths aren't going to like that, and they're going to turn on Rome. And they kind of created their own enemy within the empire. So much so that a little later on, the Goths would actually kill the Eastern Roman Emperor in a battle. We'll talk about the Eastern Roman Empire here in a little bit. And of course, the end of Rome would come with a Gothic leader, which we'll get to as well. Now, in addition to these threats within Western Rome, you've also got another threat brewing in Eastern Rome, or the Eastern Empire. And this came with the Sassanid Empire in Persia, which is in current-day Iran. So this area here, all this in yellow, you can see that is actually Roman controlled, Roman occupied. These little striped areas, which I think you should be able to see those, that was land that the Sassanid Empire actually used to control, but now is controlled by Rome. So naturally, if you are within the Sassanid Empire, you want that land back. And King Ardashir, being the man he was, wanted that land back. So now there became a threat of the Sassanid Empire in Persia invading into Eastern Rome in order to take that land back. So Rome's in with a lot of different threats, both from within and outside of their empire, that they're just not able to really hold off. Especially when you combine that with having no money to pay for an army, no men in the army, and corrupt government officials. So right now it's kind of a trifecta of issues that are causing these problems. So as we said several times, and it's no secret at this point, the empire is way too big. The Emperor Diocletian, which we've learned about, decided it was too big for just one person to govern. And honestly, looking at this, you would probably agree. This is a huge area spanning 2 separate continents, right? That's a lot of land for just one person. You can't get communication. Obviously, there's no phones or internet or anything like that to kind of spread information, so it's all by foot or by horseback or however they wanted to relay information. So, I mean, getting information from Britain to Rome would have taken forever. Getting from, the eastern half of the empire or over into Mesopotamia back into Rome would have taken forever. It just wasn't logical. So, Diocletian's response or solution is to divide it in half. So now there's two halves of the empire. You have the Western Empire and the Eastern Empire, each ruled by a separate empire, or excuse me, not an empire, an emperor. And those emperors had people called Caesars, which you could think of as like a vice emperor to kind of serve underneath them. So this was the split when Diocletian was in power. He ruled the eastern half while an emperor named Maximian ruled the western half. This was kind of his solution to this crisis they were going to in the 3rd century. Now, there were a lot of advantages that the Eastern Empire held over the Western. And that can kind of center around the Eastern half's capital city of Constantinople, which was created by the Emperor Constantine when he came to power. He reunited the entire empire, but moved the capital here to Constantinople, which, if we go back to our map here, is right here. It's Byzantium on this map, but later named Constantinople. So same place. Now, there were several different advantages that even just Constantinople on its own had. One, it's built on a peninsula, right? So it's surrounded by water on 3 sides. There's 1, there's 2, and there's 3. So right now it's already hard to get into it. If your only option is to get to it by water, you're already hindering any kind of invasion that might happen, which is good, right? Not everybody in this area will have boats, or they might not have enough people to make that trip. Could be dangerous to them. They don't really know how far it is or what kind of water they're going into. So being surrounded by water is actually a good thing. It's much easier to get attacked if you're surrounded by land, and it's easy for people to get in. Another thing was, with their city being built on a peninsula, they also built all kinds of walls around it. And in this picture, you can see all of their walls. So it goes around here and way around the other side of the peninsula over here. So it's surrounded by walls. So even if you get to it, now you have to get over these walls, which are pretty tall. It's kind of hard to tell how tall these walls are from this picture, but they're not going to be simple little 3-foot walls you can just hop over. So once you get there, if you can get there, now your struggle becomes getting into it. Because obviously they're not just going to let you in if they know you're going to attack them. They're also in a great spot for trade, right? You're surrounded by water. It's easy for those ships to come in. You have goods coming in from the Silk Road, from Asia and into China, coming in to help you out. And it just took much longer to get to the western half of Rome. So all of these things together just make it near impossible, actually, for the invaders or attackers or anybody who wants to conquer this area. Makes it impossible for them to do it, just because of all these fortifications and defenses they have up, some natural, some man-made. So instead, if you can't do that, you're just going to move on to the Western Empire. Right, and that's what happened. And finally, in 476 CE or AD, however you want to say it, you have the Gothic leader. Again, we're bringing back in the Goths. And led by their king or leader, Odoacer, sack Rome, right? So they destroy it, they take it over, and they depose the current emperor at the time, which depose just means to remove from power. The last emperor, Romulus Augustus. Now, I know we didn't learn about him, just didn't have time. But what's interesting is he was actually nicknamed Augustulus, and that just means little Augustus, because this emperor was actually a child, right? So he wasn't really seen as a legitimate empire or emperor from people in the eastern half, so that was kind of interesting. They didn't kill him. He just kind of banished him, sent him off to live with somebody else, so we don't really know what happened to Romulus after that. And of course, that brings us into the Middle Ages, where we are now. The eastern half would later be called the Byzantine Empire. It would survive for another 1,000 years or so until it was taken over by the Ottomans. There you have it. That is the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. Hopefully you guys enjoyed that. I know it was a little bit on the longer side, but of course there's a lot of information to cover. Hopefully you learned something new from it. Let me know in the comments what you want me to cover next. It can be relating to the Middle Ages, since that's what we're talking about, or really anything in history, and I'll do my best to make it happen. All right, you guys take care, have a good evening, and we'll see you soon.